He signed her name like it meant nothing. Damian Cross stood at the plaintiff's table with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved the space he occupied. He didn't look at Evelyn when he spoke. He looked at the judge, at his attorney, at Vanessa Hale sitting in the second row with her legs crossed and her phone face down on her knee. He looked at every person in that courtroom except the woman he had spent 7 years sleeping beside. She came into this marriage with nothing, he said, his voice calibrated for the room the way it always was, warm enough to seem reasonable, firm enough to seem fair. She leaves with the same. His attorney nodded. The judge reviewed the papers. Nobody objected. Evelyn sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and said nothing. If you have ever sat in a room where the person who was supposed to love you reduced you to a line item, you already know what her face looked like. If you haven't, pay attention, because this is the part that changes everything. We'll get to where this goes. But first, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that like button now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happens in the next 2 hours will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, identity, and the people we choose to become when the world strips us down to nothing. This is Evelyn's story, and it starts in a courtroom, and it ends somewhere no one saw coming. The Hargrove County Courthouse had been renovating its east wing for 11 months. The scaffolding outside the tall arched windows filtered the morning light into something gray and institutional, and the overhead fluorescents did what fluorescents always do, made everyone look slightly unwell. The air smelled like floor wax and recycled coffee, and the particular staleness of a building where difficult things happened every day without ceremony. Evelyn Ashcroft Cross had arrived 40 minutes early. Not because she was anxious. She had passed through anxiety sometime around the 4th year of her marriage, when she realized that the tight feeling in her chest whenever Damian came home late was no longer dread. It was just her body's default setting. She had arrived early because she didn't have anywhere else to be, and because she had learned long ago that being early was one of the few forms of control available to her. She wore a gray dress, not the charcoal that reads as confident, or the pale ash that reads as delicate, the flat, unremarkable gray of someone who had stopped expecting to be seen. Her hair was pinned back the way Damian had always preferred it. She realized only as she sat down that she'd done it out of habit and not intention, and she didn't bother to change it. The courtroom filled around her. Damian's legal team arrived in a cluster. 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, all of them in the specific shade of navy that signals institutional seriousness. Damian himself came in at 12 minutes before the hour, unhurried, his hand briefly touching Vanessa Hale's elbow as he passed the gallery. A gesture so small most people missed it. Evelyn didn't miss it. She had spent years learning to read the geometry of his attention. Vanessa looked extraordinary. She always looked extraordinary. It was in the most literal sense her profession. 31 years old, 3 million social media followers. A skincare collaboration that had generated more revenue last year than Evelyn's childhood home was worth. She wore ivory, which under the circumstances was either oblivious or deliberate, and her hair fell in the kind of perfect waves that require 2 hours and a team of people to achieve the appearance of effortlessness. She caught Evelyn looking and gave her a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then turned away. Evelyn looked back at the papers in front of her. 7 years. 2 apartments, 1 house, 4 cities, 3 miscarriages that Damian had characterized each time as setbacks, and moved on from within a week. 7 years of attending his firm's dinners and memorizing the names of his clients' spouses, and adjusting her own opinions in real time when she sensed they conflicted with his. 7 years of being the steady, quiet thing in the background of a life that had never really included her. She had loved him. That was the part she still couldn't quite reconcile. Not the performative love of someone who needed the security or feared being alone. She had loved him in the specific, irrational way you love a person whose flaws you can see clearly and choose to stay anyway. She had believed, for longer than she should have, that the version of him she'd fallen in love with was the real one, and the rest was just pressure, stress, ambition, the particular damage that men like him accumulated without acknowledging. She had been wrong. She understood that now. She had been wrong, and it had cost her everything she'd spent a decade building. And she was 34 years old and starting from zero, and the man responsible for it was standing 12 feet away adjusting his cufflinks without looking at her. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. The proceedings moved quickly: dissolution of marriage, division of assets, which in practice meant confirmation that there were no assets to divide because the house was in Damien's name, the accounts were in Damien's name, and the one joint account Evelyn had maintained held $11,000, which his attorney argued had been funded by marital income and was therefore subject to equitable distribution, which in this context meant Damien's attorney would take a percentage and Evelyn would walk out with roughly $8,000 and no claim to anything else. Her attorney, a woman named Rita Chen, who had taken the case pro bono after Evelyn's original representation fell through, raised several objections. She was methodical and precise and clearly outgunned by three people whose combined billable rate exceeded Evelyn's annual grocery budget. Each objection was addressed. Each address was technically sound. The system worked exactly as systems work when one party has significantly more resources than the other. Damien spoke when the judge invited him to. He stood with the ease of a man who had argued cases in rooms like this for 15 years. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform outrage or grief or any of the emotions that people sometimes deploy in these proceedings to color the record. He simply presented facts, arranged in the order most favorable to his position, with the smooth professional confidence of someone who understood that courts respond to composure. My client, his lead attorney said at one point, acknowledges the duration of the marriage and has no desire to minimize Miss Ashcroft's contributions to the household. However, the financial record clearly demonstrates she contributed nothing of measurable value, Damien said. His own attorney turned slightly. That hadn't been scripted. She came from a small town with no career, no assets, no professional training of any kind. I supported her entirely for 7 years. The lifestyle she enjoyed, the social access, the education she completed while we were married, all of it was funded by my income. I think that's relevant context. The judge looked at him. Mr. Cross, I'm not saying it cruelly, I'm saying it factually. She leaves this marriage with significantly more than she arrived with, in terms of experience and opportunity, and the settlement reflects that accurately. Rita Chen was on her feet. Your Honor, this characterization is accurate, Damien said, still calm. I wish her well. I genuinely do. But I'm not going to apologize for stating the obvious in a legal proceeding. Evelyn did not move. She was aware of Vanessa in the gallery, who had shifted slightly forward in her seat. She was aware of Damien's paralegals, one of whom was looking at his phone. She was aware of the scaffolding outside, the filtered gray light, the floor wax smell. She was aware of her own hands on the table, still folded, entirely still. She had nothing of measurable value. 7 years of her life, and the official verdict was nothing of measurable value. She thought about the miscarriages. The third one had happened on a Tuesday. Damien had had a client dinner. He'd asked if she needed him to cancel, and she had said no because she could hear in his voice that he was hoping she'd say no, and she didn't want to be the reason he disappointed a client. She had driven herself to the hospital. She had sat in the waiting room for 2 hours with her coat in her lap. She had called her sister, who lived in a different time zone, and answered on the 4th ring, sounding worried and helpless. She had driven herself home afterward and made soup because she needed something warm and there was nothing in the refrigerator. That had happened. That was real. It existed somewhere in the record of her life, even if it didn't appear in any document this courtroom would ever consider. She picked up the pen. She signed. Rita Chen touched her arm gently. Evelyn didn't look at her. Across the room, Damien was already talking quietly to his attorney, his posture loose and satisfied, the way a person looks after completing a task they'd been putting off. He glanced once in Evelyn's direction, not at her face, more in the general direction of where she was sitting, and then looked away. Vanessa caught his eye from the gallery and allowed herself a small, controlled smile. Evelyn stood. She gathered the single folder she'd brought with her. She thought about what she was going to do next. Practical things, immediate things, the logistics of a life that needed to be rebuilt from a single overnight bag and $8,000. She had a number for a short-term furnished rental that Rita had given her. She had a list of 3 possible jobs that matched her skill set as it currently existed, which was narrower than it should have been. She had 34 years of experience being alive and roughly 18 months of experience being treated like a person whose life was hers to direct. She walked toward the courtroom doors. She was 12 feet from them when the building shook. Not violently, not an earthquake, not an explosion. A vibration. Deep and resonant, traveling through the floor and up through the soles of her shoes and into her spine. A sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a pressure change, the way the air behaves when something massive displaces it. Then it came again. Low, measured, enormous. The windows at the far end of the courtroom, the ones overlooking the harbor, were trembling in their frames. People had stopped moving. Conversations had halted mid-sentence. The judge had lifted his head from the paperwork. One of Damien's paralegals had crossed to the window and was looking out with his hand shading his eyes despite the gray light. "What is that?" someone said. Evelyn knew what it was. The sound of a ship's horn at close range has a particular quality. Not the short blasts of commercial traffic, but something sustained, formal, deliberate. The sound of an arrival that intends to be acknowledged. She did not know why she knew this. She could not have explained it. But her feet had slowed before her mind had caught up, and she was standing very still in the middle of the courtroom while everyone else moved toward the windows. Through the glass, across the gray water of the harbor, a vessel was coming in. 300 feet, at minimum. Black hull, matte rather than glossy, the kind of finish that absorbed light rather than reflected it. No visible crew on the exterior decks. Moving at a speed that was controlled and deliberate rather than fast. The pace of something that had arrived exactly when it intended to and had no interest in appearing rushed. A private vessel. Enormously, unmistakably private. The kind of vessel that belonged to a category of person most people only encountered in news articles. It docked at a pier that was not the public commercial terminal. A pier that should have been closed. Evelyn watched it from the middle of the courtroom and felt something move through her that she had no name for. Not recognition exactly. Not memory. Something older and less specific, like the body's response to a sound it has heard only once, years ago, in circumstances it has since buried. She realized Damien was beside her. He had crossed the room without her noticing. He was looking out the window with an expression she recognized. The one he wore when he encountered something outside his framework of reference and hadn't yet decided how to contextualize it. "Do you know what that is?" he asked, not quite to her, not quite to the room. She didn't answer. Outside, the gangway extended, and from somewhere below deck, figures began emerging. They were dressed identically, dark suits, no visible insignia, the particular coordinated efficiency of people who had performed this sequence many times before. They descended and arranged themselves in 2 lines along the pier, a corridor of bodies facing inward. 12 of them. 14. The count kept growing. At the top of the gangway, an elderly man appeared. He was not tall. He moved carefully, the way people move when they have learned to be deliberate about their bodies after years of not needing to be. White hair, close-cropped. A dark coat that fit with the precision of something made specifically for him. He descended the gangway without assistance, without hurry, looking at nothing to either side of him. He reached the bottom. He walked the length of the corridor formed by his people, and the corridor parted, and he kept walking, and he did not stop until he was standing in the middle of the pier, and he looked up at the courthouse building directly, and his gaze, from that distance, through that glass, went somewhere specific. It went to Evelyn. She felt it land. She could not explain this. She did not try. The man below held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and removed something. A photograph, she thought, though from this distance she couldn't be certain. He looked at it. He looked back up at her. He said something to the man standing nearest to him. The man nodded. And then that man walked toward the courthouse entrance. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Damien was still beside her. She could hear him breathing. Across the room, Vanessa had stood up in the gallery, her phone raised, already filming. Rita Chen appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. "Do you know what's happening?" "No," Evelyn said. But her hands, which had been perfectly still all morning, were trembling now. Not from fear. From something she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten it was a sensation that belonged to her. The courtroom doors opened. The man who entered was younger than the one on the pier, perhaps 50, with the build of someone who had once been physical and maintained the habit. He wore the same dark suit. He crossed the courtroom without looking at anyone except Evelyn, and when he reached her, he stopped, and he bowed. A genuine formal bow, not a nod or an incline of the head, but the full deliberate gesture of deep respect. And when he straightened, he said, in accented English that placed him somewhere Mediterranean, Princess. The word hit the room like a physical thing. Someone made a sound. Damien went very still beside her. Your father has been waiting for you. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at his face, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance, the expression of a man delivering a message he believed with absolute certainty. She looked past him, through the courtroom windows, to the pier where the elderly man was still standing, still looking up, still holding whatever he had taken from his pocket. And for a moment, just one moment, suspended between everything she had been and everything that was about to begin, Evelyn Ashcroft Cross stood in the middle of a gray courthouse in a gray dress with $8,000 and no claim to anything, and felt the floor of the world she'd built tilt beneath her feet. Then it gave way entirely. Outside, the harbor reflected the black hull of the vessel, and the old man on the pier did not move, and the city that had never once noticed Evelyn was about to learn her name. The man didn't wait for her to respond. He straightened from his bow, clasped his hands in front of him, and stood with the patience of someone who had been sent to deliver a message and had no instructions beyond that. His eyes stayed on Evelyn. Not on the judge, not on Damien, not on Vanessa, who was still filming from the gallery with her phone angled like a weapon. On Evelyn. Only Evelyn. She realized the entire courtroom was waiting for her to speak. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. That surprised her. Her hands were still trembling at her sides, but her voice held, and she filed that information away the way she had learned to file things, quietly, for later. The man tilted his head a fraction. I understand this is unexpected, Miss Cross, but Mr. DeLuca has traveled a considerable distance. He asks only that you come to the pier. Nothing more is required of you beyond that. DeLuca, the judge said. He'd said it the way people say a word when they recognize it but can't immediately place why, and then in the next half-second you could watch the placement arrive on his face. His expression shifted. Not dramatically. He was a judge. He had professional control of his face, but something behind his eyes reorganized. Damien heard it too. She could tell by the particular quality of silence that came off him. Alessandro DeLuca, Rita Chen said quietly at Evelyn's shoulder. Not a question. A confirmation of something she was rapidly processing. The name was doing work in the room. Evelyn could feel it, the way a temperature drop moves through a space before you consciously register the cold. People who had been standing at the windows turned around. The paralegal with the phone had put it away. I don't have a father, Evelyn said. My father died when I was 60. You were told that, the man said, gently, not cruelly. The way you correct someone about a fact they couldn't have known was wrong. Mr. DeLuca would like to explain the rest himself. Damien stepped forward then. She hadn't expected it. That particular species of his confidence, the one that expressed itself as movement into space that wasn't offered to him. Who are you? He said to the man, his attorney's voice, controlled and declarative. And on what legal basis are you making contact with my— We are divorced, Evelyn said. Damien stopped. As of approximately 40 minutes ago, she said. So whatever you were about to say, you should probably choose the ending more carefully. He looked at her. She couldn't read his expression, and that was new. For 7 years she had been able to read him the way you read weather, by accumulated observation and pattern recognition, and now his face was something she didn't have the key for anymore. Maybe it had always been that way, and she'd been translating static into meaning. The man from the pier, she still didn't have his name, made a small gesture toward the door. Whenever you're ready. There's no urgency. Mr. DeLuca is a patient man. He's waited this long, someone muttered from the gallery. She thought it was Vanessa, but when she looked, Vanessa's face was unreadable too. The phone now pointed at the floor, her jaw set. Evelyn looked at Rita. Rita looked back at her with the expression of someone who had stopped having useful advice approximately 90 seconds ago. It's your call, she said. You don't have to go anywhere. I know. She picked up her folder. She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Damien say something to his attorney, low and fast. She didn't catch the words. She didn't turn around. The harbor air was colder than the courthouse had been, with the particular wet edge of water in autumn, and it hit her face when she came through the building's main entrance like something she hadn't prepared for. The man from the vessel walked beside her, half a step back, and neither of them spoke. The pier was a 10-minute walk. She made it in 8. Alessandro De Luca was shorter in proximity than he had appeared from the courtroom window. This was the first thing she registered, and she was mildly ashamed of how much attention she was paying to it, as though the irrelevant physical detail was a way of keeping her mind occupied while the larger thing waited to be looked at directly. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older. His white hair was neat without being groomed for performance. His hands, when he held one out toward her, were scarred across the knuckles. Old scars, the kind that had faded to the same color as the surrounding skin but hadn't disappeared. She did not take his hand. He lowered it without reaction. "You look exactly like her," he said. His English carried the architecture of Italian beneath it, not an accent so much as a structural inheritance, the particular way the language organized itself in his mouth. "Your mother, the shape of your eyes, the way you hold your face when you are deciding something." "I don't know you," Evelyn said. "No. You were 9 years old the last time you saw me." He paused. "You had a white rabbit. You named it Signora Bianchi because you had just learned 3 words in Italian and you wanted to use them." The breath went out of her. She didn't know why that specific detail. Not something she could have fabricated or easily researched. The rabbit had existed for 8 months of her 9th year, and she had not thought about it in decades, and the name was something she had never told anyone. Not Damien, not her sister, not Rita Chen. "That doesn't mean anything," she said. Her voice had thinned. She hated that. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't mean enough. I know that." He reached into his breast pocket. This was what she'd watched from the courthouse window, the gesture she'd seen from a distance, and produced a photograph. He held it out. She took it because not taking it felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. It was a photograph of a child, 8 or 9 years old, gap-toothed, standing in bright sunlight in a garden that she did not recognize but that triggered something in the back of her skull, a sense of familiar spatial arrangement without the memory to go with it. The child was holding a white rabbit. The child was her. She recognized herself the way you recognize your own handwriting, not by deliberate comparison, but by immediate certainty, the thing that bypasses analysis. She turned the photograph over. Written on the back in a handwriting that was not hers, Elena, age 9. Villa di Maremma, June. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "Yes," Alessandro said. "Now it is." Behind her, from somewhere up the pier, she heard footsteps. She turned. Damien had followed her. Of course he had. He was in the grip of the specific compulsion that powerful men feel when something happens outside their control. The need to be present even when presence isn't offered. He'd come alone. His attorney had apparently had the sense to stay behind. He stopped when he saw Alessandro clearly. "I was doing the thing again. The recalibration, the assessment, the rapid internal reorganization of what he was looking at. She'd watched him do it in depositions. He was good at it. It usually took him about 4 seconds. "Alessandro De Luca," Damien said. "You're Alessandro De Luca." "Yes." "The Alessandro De Luca." Alessandro looked at him with the patience of a man who no longer needed anything from anyone. "I am aware of only one." Damien's eyes moved to Evelyn. She watched the math happen on his face, the calculation running backward through 7 years of marriage, through the small-town story she'd told him and that he'd never questioned because it suited him not to question it, through every dinner party and client event where she'd stood beside him saying little and smiling at the right moments. He'd kept her quiet because quiet was useful. He'd never considered that quiet might be strategic. "You didn't know," Damien said to her. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know now," she said. "I don't know anything now." "Elena," Alessandro began. "Don't call me that." It came out with more force than she'd intended. "Not yet. You don't get to just... Not yet." He stopped. He nodded. The gesture of a man who had anticipated this and had decided before arriving that he would accept whatever she gave him. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Not the version you've been preparing, the actual version." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Come aboard. There are people who will want to be present for this conversation, people who have waited as long as I have." "I'm not going aboard your ship." "Then I'll tell you here." He said it without hesitation, which surprised her. She had expected negotiation. "You were 9 years old. There was an attempt on my life, a real one, not the kind that sends a message, the kind that intends to end things. They took you to make me stop looking. They told you I was dead because a child who believes her father is dead doesn't search, doesn't ask, doesn't eventually piece things together. His voice remained even throughout this. It was the evenness of a person who had rehearsed grief until it became something he could carry without dropping. I spent 15 years. Every investigator I had, every contact, 3 continents. I found evidence you were alive 8 years ago. I lost the trail again. I found it again 6 months ago, and I have not looked away since. The wind off the water was steady and cold. Evelyn was aware of Damien very still behind her, aware of the security men at their intervals along the pier, not close enough to hear, close enough to respond, aware of the photograph still in her hand. "Who took me?" she said. Alessandro's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a tightening, like a door closing on a room you weren't supposed to see into. That is the conversation that requires the others present. "Who took me?" He held her gaze. "Someone I trusted completely. Someone who is not a stranger to either of us." That landed wrong. She felt it, the specific wrongness of a sentence that contains more than it's saying. She looked at Damien. He shook his head slightly. "Don't look at me. I didn't know any of this." "I'm not looking at you," she said. "I'm thinking." She looked back at Alessandro. "Give me an hour," she said finally. Alessandro inclined his head. "Take whatever you need." She turned and walked back up the pier toward the city, and she didn't look at Damien as she passed him, and she didn't look back at the ship, and she walked until she found a bench 3 blocks from the water and sat on it with her folder in her lap and the photograph in her hand, and let herself do the things she hadn't allowed herself to do in the courtroom. She shook. Full body, uncontrollable, the kind of shaking that happens when something enormous has been held together by will alone and the will finally releases. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped, because she made it stop, and she breathed, and she looked at the photograph of the child she had been, and she thought. She thought about the things she didn't remember, the gap in her memory before age 10. She had always explained it as the normal childhood blur, the way early years compress into impressions rather than sequences. The recurring dream she'd had for years, a garden, white stone walls, the smell of something growing, a voice calling a name she couldn't quite hear. The absolute certainty, age 16 when she'd been told her father had died of a heart attack, that something in the account was wrong. Not the grief was real, but the details hadn't arranged themselves correctly, and she'd eventually stopped questioning it because what was the point? She thought about the rabbit named Signore Bianchi, which she had not consciously remembered until an old man with scarred hands said the words, and then she'd remembered it completely and immediately. She looked at the photograph. She stood up. She walked back to the pier. Alessandro was exactly where she'd left him. She had been gone 23 minutes. "I'll come aboard," she said. "But I need you to understand something. I am not your daughter yet. I am a woman who is considering information. If what you're telling me is true, then we have things to discuss. If it isn't, then I will walk off this ship and you will never attempt to contact me again. Those are the terms." Alessandro held her gaze. "Those are fair terms." "I know they are." She walked up the gangway. What she didn't see, because she was looking forward, Damien pulling out his phone as she disappeared from view. His face tense with something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite calculation. It was the space between them, the particular expression of a man who has realized, too late, that something he dismissed was worth paying attention to. And 3 blocks away, in a car with tinted windows that had been parked since before the ship arrived, a phone began to ring. The person in the car looked at the screen, let it ring twice, then answered. "She went aboard," they said. A pause. Then a voice on the other end, unhurried, almost amused. "Good. Let her get comfortable." The car didn't move. Inside the vessel, Evelyn was being led through corridors that were spare rather than opulent, functional, almost monastic in their restraint, which was not what she had expected and which she noted. The security man who'd come to the courthouse, she now knew his name was Marco, walked ahead of her without speaking. They descended 1 level, then another. They entered a room that was clearly designed for meetings rather than comfort. A long table, 8 chairs, screens on 2 walls, currently dark, a single window looking out at the water, and through it the courthouse was visible in the distance, gray and unchanged. 3 people were already seated at the table. An attorney, clearly, The organized chaos of files in front of him signaled the type. A woman in her 60s who held herself with the particular uprightness of someone accustomed to institutional authority. And a younger man, perhaps 35, with Alessandro's coloring but different eyes, watchful eyes, the kind that don't settle anywhere for long. Alessandro entered behind Evelyn and took the chair at the head of the table. He gestured for her to sit. She sat. "These are my people," he said. "Dominic, my legal counsel. Catherine, who has been coordinating the search for you for 11 years. And Lucien." He said the last name the way parents say the names of children they are proud of, with a particular forward emphasis, a declaration. The young man, Lucien, looked at Evelyn with a smile that was precise and warm and arrived slightly too quickly. "My sister," he said, "at last." Evelyn looked at him. Something moved through her that she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't recognition. It was the thing you feel when a piece of information is presented to you and your brain accepts its surface while something deeper runs a parallel assessment. "Adopted," she said. A flicker, barely visible, gone in an instant. "Since I was 12. Your father is a generous man." Alessandro said, "Lucien has been my right hand for 20 years. Everything I would have taught you, he has learned in your absence." "And now I'm here," Evelyn said. "And now you're here," Lucien agreed. The smile didn't move. That was what her brain had caught, she realized. A smile that arrived fully formed and then held its position rather than shifting with the natural mobility of genuine feeling. The expression of a person monitoring themselves. The attorney, Dominic, opened a file. "There are documents we'd like you to review. Proof of identity, medical records, the original birth registration under Elena De Luca. DNA confirmation can be arranged within 48 hours if you—" "Tell me about the person who took me," Evelyn said. The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of people who don't know the answer, the quiet of people arranging how much of it to give. Alessandro said, "That investigation is ongoing. You said the person wasn't a stranger to either of us." Lucien leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, these are details that require context. There are things in motion that— "I just signed divorce papers 3 hours ago," she said. "My husband of 7 years publicly stated in a court of law that I contributed nothing of measurable value to my own life. I have $8,000 and an overnight bag and a furnished rental I haven't seen yet. My threshold for complexity is quite high right now, so I'd suggest you say the actual thing." Silence. Then Alessandro said, "The attorney who arranged your disappearance, who forged the documents, erased the records, created the identity you grew up with." He paused. "His name was Robert Cross." The air in the room changed. Evelyn heard the name and felt something cold move through the space behind her sternum. Robert Cross. The name of Damien's late father, whom she'd met twice, once at a charity dinner when she and Damien had been dating, and once at Robert's funeral, 2 years into the marriage. An attorney. Corporate law, Damien always said, with the pride of someone invoking a lineage. Corporate law. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "Yes," Alessandro said, "which is why certain things only became clear to us recently." "Damien doesn't know." She said it before she'd decided to say it. But she was certain as she said it. Whatever Damien was, he was not a man who could have maintained that performance for 7 years. He'd had no idea. "We believe that's correct," Dominic said carefully. "But someone does know," Evelyn said. "Someone who's been using that connection. Someone who knew that if Damien was in my life, and I was using the name Cross—" She stopped. The shape of it was assembling itself. "It kept me close. Someone who knew who I was has been watching me stay exactly where they could reach me." The room was very quiet. Lucien said carefully, "That's a significant conclusion to reach without—" "Is it wrong?" she said. Nobody answered. That was its own kind of answer. She pushed back her chair, stood, walked to the window and looked out at the harbor and the courthouse and the city beyond it, all of it gray and ordinary and completely rearranged. She had come into this morning as the invisible woman, the woman with nothing of measurable value. Someone had worked very hard for a very long time to make sure she stayed that way. She turned from the window. "Show me the DNA documentation process," she said to Dominic, "and I want everything you have on Robert Cross. Every document, every transaction, Every name he was connected to in the 18 months before I was placed with the family I grew up with. She looked at Alessandro. And I want to know who else knew, not just who did it, who knew, and stayed quiet, and let it stay buried. Alessandro looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't read yet. But Lucien, beside him, was very still. And outside in the city, Damien Cross was sitting on the courthouse steps with his phone in his hand, staring at his father's name in his contacts. A memorial entry he'd never deleted. And beginning to understand that the career he'd spent 15 years building was constructed on a foundation he had never once thought to examine. The ship didn't move. Not yet. But the current beneath it had already changed direction, and no one on the pier looking on would have known it from the surface, which was exactly how the person watching from the tinted car had intended it to stay. The phone in the car rang again. This time, the person answered on the first ring. "She's asking about Robert Cross," they said. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. When it spoke, something in its register had shifted. Still controlled, still unhurried, but with an edge beneath it now, the sound of a plan that has just moved into its next and most dangerous phase. "Then we're out of time," the voice said. "Move to the next step, tonight." The call ended. The car still didn't move. Inside the vessel, Evelyn sat back down at the table and watched Dominic arrange documents with the careful efficiency of a man who had been waiting years for this specific meeting. He laid things out in chronological order: birth records, hospital documentation, photographs spanning decades, the paper trail of a life that had existed in full before it was surgically removed and replaced with something smaller and safer and entirely controllable. She read without speaking. Alessandro sat at the head of the table and did not rush her. That restraint told her something about him, that he had learned, across 15 years of searching, to be a man who could wait. Lucien sat across from her and said nothing, and she was aware of his silence the way you're aware of a sound that stops suddenly, the absence drawing more attention than the presence had. Catherine, the older woman, refilled the water glass at Evelyn's elbow without being asked. A small gesture. Evelyn noted it. The birth record was in Italian and English, side by side. Elena Maria De Luca, born in a private medical facility outside Florence. Mother, Sofia Renata De Luca, née Caruso. Deceased, a date, 18 months after Elena's birth. The cause of death was listed in clinical language that said everything and communicated nothing. Evelyn looked at the date for a long time. "My mother," she said. "She was extraordinary," Alessandro said. "You have her stubbornness." A pause. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Evelyn set the document down. "Who raised me? After whoever took me? Who did they place me with?" "A family in Ohio, the Ashcrofts. We believe they were paid. We believe they were told you were an orphan from an overseas adoption arrangement that had become complicated. They may not have known the full picture." "They didn't," Evelyn said, flat and certain. "They were ordinary people. Whatever they were paid, they didn't know." She said it the way you close a door, firmly, without drama. The Ashcrofts were not part of this. She would not let them become part of this. Lucian shifted in his seat. The movement was small, but she caught it. "Something you want to add?" she said, without looking at him directly. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking you're remarkably composed, given everything." "I'm not composed," she said. "I'm functional. Those are different things." She turned back to the documents. The next page was a bank transfer record, the original payment, a wire transfer from an account that had since been dissolved to a law firm trust account. The law firm's name was Cross, Weller, and Hargreave, Robert Cross's firm. She stared at the number on the transfer. It was substantial, not life-changing for someone at Alessandro's level of operation, but substantial. Enough to suggest this had not been improvised. Enough to suggest someone had provided the funding and Robert Cross had been the instrument, not the architect. "This money," she said. "Where did it originate?" Dominic looked at Alessandro. Alessandro gave a small nod. "The source account," Dominic said carefully, "has been traced through 3 intermediary structures. The origin point was a financial holding company connected to the De Luca family's own internal investment architecture." She looked up. "The money that paid for your disappearance," Alessandro said, his voice absolutely level, came from inside my own organization. The room absorbed that. So whoever did this had access to your internal finances, Evelyn said. Yes. 25 years ago. Yes. And has potentially had that access since. Alessandro held her gaze. We believe the access has continued in various forms, restructured, made to look like legitimate operational flow, but yes. She looked at Lucien. He met her eyes without flinching. His expression was exactly right, concerned, attentive, the face of someone hearing difficult information and processing it responsibly. It was so exactly right that it operated, in her mind, as its own kind of data point. She looked back at the transfer document. I'd like copies of everything, she said. All of it, tonight. Of course, Dominic said. Alessandro stood. The motion carried a weight that his stillness hadn't. The movement of a man whose body carried years of decisions, some of which had gone catastrophically wrong. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, looking at the harbor. I know I cannot simply present you with documents and have a daughter, he said. I know that what was taken from us cannot be returned by a conversation on a ship. He turned. But I want you to understand, everything I have built, everything I have protected, every choice I have made for 25 years, it has been in the context of a world where you might still be alive, where I might one day have the chance to stand in front of you and say that I did not stop, not once. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the courtroom that morning, about Damien's voice saying nothing of measurable value, about the specific quality of being dismissed by a person who is supposed to see you. She thought about a white rabbit named Signora Bianchi, and a garden she almost remembered, and a voice calling a name that was hers before it was taken. I believe you searched, she said quietly. I'm not ready to say more than that yet. That's enough, Alessandro said. For now, that's enough. She gathered the copies Dominic had assembled and stood. Marco appeared at the door. She hadn't heard him approach, which told her the room was being monitored, which she filed away without reacting to. I'm going to the rental tonight, she said. I need to sleep. I need to think without people watching me think. She looked around the room deliberately so everyone understood she meant all of them. Tomorrow morning, I'll come back and we'll discuss next steps. Alessandro nodded. Marco will arrange a car and a security detail. It isn't optional, Alessandro said. Not harshly, with the tone of a man stating physics rather than preference. Whoever did this knows you're here now. The ship docked in broad daylight in front of a courthouse full of people, and half of them had phones. This is not a secret anymore, which means you are not safe in the way you were this morning, when nobody knew who you were. She considered arguing. She decided it wasn't the right hill. Fine, she said. 1 car, 2 people. They stay outside. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped without turning around. Lucien, she said. Yes? How old were you when you were adopted? A beat. Barely perceptible. 12. And Alessandro found you. Where? Naples. I was living on the street. He gave me a life. She nodded slowly as though absorbing this. That's a significant debt, she said, to carry for 20 years. She walked out before he could answer. Behind her, in the meeting room, the silence stretched for 3 full seconds. Then Lucien reached forward, very calmly, and turned his water glass a quarter turn on the table. A small, contained movement. The kind a person makes when they need to do something with their hands and have learned not to let it show on their face. Alessandro was watching the door Evelyn had just walked through. He did not see it. Catherine did. She said nothing. The car that took Evelyn to the rental was black and unremarkable, and the 2 security men who rode with her were quiet and professional and positioned themselves outside the building's entrance without being asked. She went upstairs to an apartment that smelled like fresh paint and had a bed with 3 pillows and a window overlooking a parking structure, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the folder of documents in her lap. Her phone had 14 missed calls, 3 from Rita, 7 from a number she didn't recognize, 4 from Damien. She called Rita back first. Are you all right? Rita asked immediately. I don't know yet, Evelyn said. Ask me in a week. Evelyn, the media has the story. Someone filmed from the gallery. I'm assuming Vanessa. And it's been running for the last 2 hours. Alessandro De Luca's name is everywhere. She absorbed that. Okay. Okay? What would you like me to say, Rita? A pause. I'd like you to say you have a plan. Evelyn looked at the transfer document, at the law firm's name, at the number that had purchased her disappearance and rearranged the entire architecture of her life. I'm working on one, she said. She ended the call. She did not call Damien back. She lay down on the bed with her coat still on and the folder on her chest, and she stared at the ceiling of a room she'd never been in before. And she thought about a man on a pier holding a photograph, and a younger man with a smile that held its position too long, and 25 years of money moving through structures designed to be invisible. She thought, someone in that room tonight is still working against me. She thought, I have to figure out which one before they figure out that I know. Somewhere across the city, in the tinted car that had finally begun to move, a phone buzzed with a single incoming message. 3 words. She took the documents. The reply came back in under 10 seconds. Perfect. Let her read them. The car moved through the dark city streets, unhurried, its destination already decided, its passenger already several moves ahead, or so they believed. What they had not accounted for was that the woman in the rental apartment with 3 pillows and a parking structure view had spent 7 years learning to read rooms where everyone was pretending, and she was very, very good at it. She didn't sleep. She told herself she would give it 2 hours. Lie down, let the body rest, even if the mind wouldn't. Let the accumulated weight of the day settle into something she could sort through in the morning. That was the plan. The plan lasted approximately 20 minutes before she was sitting up again with the folder open across her knees and her coat still on and the parking structure outside throwing orange security light across the ceiling in strips. She read everything twice. Then she read the financial documents a 3rd time, specifically because numbers didn't lie the way people did. Numbers just sat there and waited to be understood correctly. And she had the persistent feeling she was one framework shift away from understanding these ones correctly. The transfer had originated inside the DeLuca financial architecture. That was the fact Alessandro had given her, and she believed it, because it was the kind of detail you didn't volunteer if you were trying to conceal something. You only offered it if you'd already accepted that concealment on that specific point was no longer viable. But the routing. She kept coming back to the routing. 3 intermediary structures between the origin account and the cross, Weller and Hargreave Trust. 3 shells, each one dissolved within 18 months of the transaction. That level of structural layering 25 years ago required specific knowledge, not just of the DeLuca finances, but of how to move through them without triggering internal oversight, which meant the person who'd done this hadn't just had access. They'd had administrative access, the kind that let you build the walls and open the doors simultaneously. At 2 in the morning, she got up, made coffee from the single-serve machine on the kitchen counter, and stood at the window drinking it while the security men sat in the car below, one of them reading something on his phone with the screen brightness turned down. She thought about Lucy Yen. She thought about a 12-year-old boy from Naples, found on the street, brought into a household as a replacement. Not consciously, maybe. Alessandro wouldn't have framed it that way, but structurally. The daughter was gone, the heir was gone, and here was a child who could be shaped and trained and handed everything. 20 years of learning the operation from the inside. 20 years of acquiring exactly the kind of knowledge that would let you route money through 3 shells and leave no visible trace. She thought about his smile, the one that arrived complete and held its position. She thought about what he'd said. Your father is a generous man. Present tense. The phrasing of someone who had spent 2 decades carefully managing how Alessandro DeLuca thought about him. At 3:15, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, different from the 7 missed calls from earlier. She almost didn't answer. Then she did, because every instinct she'd developed across 7 years of reading rooms told her this specific buzz, at this specific hour, was not something she could afford to let go to voicemail. Ms. Cross. A woman's voice, clipped, low, the consonants precise in the way of someone who had learned English as a 3rd or 4th language. My name is not important. What is important is that you are reading documents tonight that have been prepared for you to read. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. Go on. The financial records Dominic gave you are accurate as far as they go, but they were selected. There is a second transfer. Same origin account, different destination, dated 14 months ago. That was not included in your folder. The back of her neck went cold. What does it fund? It funds a security consultancy registered in Malta. The consultancy has 1 client. A pause, calibrated. The client is Vanessa Hale. Evelyn didn't move for 3 full seconds. Vanessa. Damien's Vanessa, with the ivory dress and the phone angled like a weapon. 3 million followers and a skincare deal and a smile that had landed on Evelyn like a verdict every time they'd occupied the same room. Someone inside the DeLuca organization has been financing Vanessa Hale, Evelyn said slowly, for 14 months. The payments began 1 month after Alessandro's investigators identified your location. Someone inside that organization learned you had been found and immediately began building a secondary layer. Ms. Hale was recruited as an asset. Her relationship with your former husband was not accidental. It was arranged. To keep me in place, Evelyn said. To keep me in a marriage I'd eventually leave with nothing, isolated, discredited, with no claim to any identity that could threaten anyone. She heard her own voice saying it and felt the specific, ice-cold quality of a rage that had no surface heat to it, the deep kind, the kind that doesn't want to shout, it wants to dismantle. Who is calling me? Someone who has worked for Alessandro DeLuca for 30 years and does not intend to watch everything he built be taken from the inside. Another pause. Come to the ship in the morning, but don't go to the meeting room. Ask Marco to take you to Alessandro directly. Alone. Show him what I've told you before Lucian has the chance to frame the conversation. The line went dead. Evelyn stood at the window for a long time after that. The security man in the car below had put his phone away and was looking straight ahead at nothing. She thought, if this call is real, Lucien is the architect of everything and Alessandro doesn't know. She thought, if this call is a manipulation, then someone wants me to walk onto that ship tomorrow and accuse a man Alessandro has trusted for 20 years, which destroys any chance of the alliance I need, and leaves me alone and discredited and exactly as vulnerable as I was this morning. She thought, either way, I have to go back to the ship. She lay down again at 4, slept 40 minutes, woke without an alarm at 5:43, showered, dressed in the same gray dress because she had nothing else, drank the rest of the cold coffee, and went downstairs. The security man on the left, the one who'd been reading, got out of the car when he saw her. Ms. Cross, it's early. I know, she said. I'd like to go to the ship. He looked at his partner. Something passed between them without words. Mr. DeLuca isn't expecting you until... I know when he's expecting me, she said. I'd like to go now. Another beat. Then the door opened. The harbor at 6 in the morning was a different place than it had been at noon. The gray water was darker, the light not yet committed to the day, and the ship sat at the pier with only its running lights visible, enormous and black and utterly still. 2 of the security cordon remained at the gangway. The others had presumably rotated inside. They admitted her without question, which told her that Alessandro had anticipated she might come early, or that her security detail had called ahead during the drive. Marco met her at the top of the gangway. She said, before he could speak, I need to see Alessandro, not the meeting room, him directly, alone. Marco looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his standard setting, attentive, giving nothing, waiting. Mr. DeLuca is on the upper deck, he said. He doesn't sleep well on ships anymore. Take me up. Alessandro was standing at the stern rail with a cup of something that steamed in the cold air, looking at the city the way people look at things they have wanted to see for a long time. He turned when he heard them approach, and his face shifted. Not surprise, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had hoped and had learned not to trust hope, and was now experiencing both at the same time. Marco withdrew. Evelyn stood 6 feet from Alessandro and looked at him in the gray early light and said, I need you to tell me everything you know about Lucian's role in your financial operations. Not the version you'd give a board meeting, the actual version. Every account he has access to, every authorization level, every decision he's made independently in the last 5 years. Alessandro was very still. What has happened? Someone called me at 3 this morning. They told me about a second transfer, 14 months ago. Same origin account as the one in my documents, routed to a Maltese consultancy that has been paying Vanessa Hale. The cup in Alessandro's hand didn't move. His face didn't move. But something behind his eyes shifted, slow and enormous, like a tectonic thing. Repeat that, he said quietly. She repeated it. He set the cup down on the rail. He turned and looked at the city. She watched his jaw tighten. The deep muscle at the hinge, the kind of tension that doesn't come from anger alone, but from the specific agony of a suspicion that has just been confirmed from an unexpected direction. "How long have you suspected him?" she said. A long silence. "There have been inconsistencies," Alessandro said. "Small ones, the kind that are easy to explain individually. 11 months ago, I asked Dominic to run a quiet audit of the discretionary accounts Lucian manages. The audit came back clean." He paused. "Dominic reported to me directly, but Lucian reviewed the audit parameters before it ran, because he nominally oversees Dominic's office. So the audit was clean because Lucian knew what it would look at. That is one interpretation. Is there another one?" He turned back to face her. In the growing light, she could see him more clearly now. The age in his face, the particular exhaustion of a man who had held something together by will alone for longer than any single person should have to. "I have loved that boy for 20 years, he said. It wasn't a defense, it was an accounting, the statement of a man being precise about the nature of his own vulnerability. "I know," she said, and she did. She knew exactly what it felt like to love someone who was using that love as a structural component of something you weren't supposed to be able to see. The door behind them opened. Lucian stepped through it. He was dressed with his characteristic precision. Dark trousers, a collared shirt, unhurried at 6 in the morning, in the way of someone who had been awake for hours. His eyes moved from Alessandro to Evelyn and back, and the assessment happened in under a second. And then his face assembled itself into the expression of a man who was mildly surprised and entirely untroubled. "You're here early," he said to Evelyn. "Couldn't sleep?" "No," she said. "Neither could I." He moved to the rail, leaving a deliberate amount of space between himself and both of them, which positioned him to see both their faces. A geometry of conversation that felt chosen. "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About the person who arranged your disappearance having internal access. I think there are some financial records you should see today that might help clarify the source." "What records?" Alessandro said. "The discretionary accounts from the pre-restructuring period, specifically the ones managed by the old Treasury office. Before my time." He said it smoothly. Before my time. The phrase of a man installing a wall between himself and something. "I think if you cross-reference the routing structures with the personnel files from that period, you'll find a name you recognize." "Whose name?" Evelyn said. Lucian looked at her. "Catherine's." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evelyn had heard since the ship's horn the morning before. Catherine. The woman in her 60s who had refilled her water glass without being asked, who had watched Lucien turn his water glass a quarter turn and said nothing, who had, according to Alessandro, been coordinating the search for Evelyn for 11 years. "Catherine has been with me for 32 years, Alessandro said. His voice had gone flat. The voice of a man who has shut down the emotional processing because if he doesn't, the structural processing won't function. "I know," Lucian said, sorrowfully, precisely calibrated sorrow. "That's what makes it so difficult." Evelyn looked at Lucian. She looked at the sorrow on his face. She looked at the positioning of his body at the rail, the angles he'd chosen, the way his hands rested. Relaxed, deliberate relaxed, the specific muscular effort of a person making their own stillness look natural. She thought, this is what it looks like. This is the exact texture of it. Someone who has had 20 years of practice making Alessandro look in the wrong direction. She thought, the person who called me last night. The woman, 30 years with Alessandro, precise consonants. That was Catherine. She called me because she knew what this morning would look like, because she had seen it before, because she has watched this man redirect Alessandro's attention for 2 decades, and she has been unable to prove it alone. She thought, if I say any of this right now, Lucien will have a prepared response. He came up here because Marco told someone she'd arrived early, and that someone told Lucien, and Lucien has been standing somewhere in this ship for the last 20 minutes, composing this exact moment. "Where is Catherine now?" she asked. Her voice was level. Lucian's eyes moved to her. A fraction of a second's assessment. "Her cabin, I'd assume. She keeps early hours. Can someone check on her?" "Of course." He said it easily. Reached into his pocket for his phone. Made a call in Italian, brief. The request sent with the practiced fluency of a man who had been running people for years. 30 seconds of silence on the deck. Then the person on the other end said something. Lucian's expression didn't change. That was the tell. Not a flinch, not a reaction, the absolute neutral maintenance of a face that had been trained not to respond. "I see," he said into the phone. "Yes. Stay where you are." He ended the call and looked at Alessandro. "Catherine isn't in her cabin. According to the security log, she left the ship at 4:47 this morning." Alessandro looked at him. "I'm sorry," Lucian said. "I think she may have known we were getting close." Evelyn watched Alessandro's face and saw the thing she'd feared, the credible doubt landing, the 32 years of trust in Catherine beginning to flex against the 20 years of trust in Lucian, and the math of it, in this moment, still favoring Lucian because he was here and she was gone, and gone looked like guilt even when it looked like something else entirely. "Alessandro," she said. He looked at her. "She called me last night," Evelyn said, "at 3 in the morning. She told me about the Maltese consultancy and the payments to Vanessa Hale. She told me to come to you this morning alone before Lucian could frame the conversation." The deck was absolutely silent. Lucian said, "Evelyn, don't," she said. "Don't use my name like that." She turned fully to face him. "You want to tell him she's the one who's been feeding me information to manipulate me against you. You want to tell him that a woman who has worked for 30 years for someone she respects manufactured an enemy for me to identify because she wanted to protect her own position. You've had this version ready since the moment Marco told you I came aboard early." She took a step toward him. "The only thing you didn't account for is that I spent 7 years married to a man who was excellent at exactly this. And I got very, very good at recognizing when someone is building a story around a room instead of reporting what's actually in it." Lucian looked at her. For the first time since she'd met him, the smile wasn't there. Not gone. It had simply not arrived. His face, without the smile, was a different face entirely. Harder. Organized differently. The face of someone whose control was still intact but whose performance had been interrupted. "You have no proof," he said quietly. "No," she said. "Not yet." "Then you're making a serious accusation against someone who has earned—" The explosion removed the rest of his sentence from the air. It came from below, from the lower decks, somewhere toward the stern, a concussive blast that transmitted itself through the deck, plating and up through the soles of her feet before the sound fully reached her ears. The ship shuddered. Not the tremor of the horn the morning before, a violence, the specific brutal physics of something being destroyed from the inside. Then the second one, closer, louder. A pressure change that popped her ears and sent Alessandro into the rail and sent her down to one knee on the deck before she'd processed the decision to move. Alarms. The ship's alarm system, instantaneous and aggressive, cutting through the post-blast ringing in her ears with the high, sustained note of a vessel in emergency protocol. Lucien had not fallen. He was standing exactly where he'd been, both hands gripping the rail, looking at the door he'd come through with an expression that had reorganized again. Not fear. Calculation. The face of a man assessing whether a timeline had accelerated or broken. That expression lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the fear arrived, constructed over the calculation, pulling the correct muscles into the correct positions. She saw it happen. She saw the sequence. Men were coming through the door. Alessandro's security, moving fast, 2 of them going directly to Alessandro, 1 breaking toward Evelyn. "We need to move," he said, his hand on her arm, firm and non-negotiable. "What is that?" she said. "What's happening below?" "Explosions in the engine compartment and secondary storage. We have fire suppression running, but the lower deck is compromised." He was already moving her toward the interior. "We need to get you off the ship." Alessandro was being moved by his own team, his face gray but his feet steady. He looked back at Evelyn over the shoulder of the man guiding him, and his eyes said something she didn't have time to read completely. Lucien fell into step behind Alessandro's detail, the concerned adopted son, positioned precisely where he should be. Evelyn let herself be moved through the interior corridor, down 1 level, toward the starboard side. Around her, the ship was organized chaos. Not panic, trained response, people moving with the efficiency of a crew that had protocols for exactly this. But beneath the efficiency, she could feel the thing that protocols couldn't fully contain. The understanding that this had been deliberate, that someone had placed those charges, that the vessel that was supposed to be the safest possible place for her was the location someone had specifically chosen to turn into a trap. The gangway was being cleared. Dawn light now, the harbor brightening around them, the pier filling with personnel. She could see emergency vehicles in the distance moving toward the waterfront. The security man who'd brought her topside was at her shoulder when she stopped walking. "Ms. Cross, Alessandro," she said. "Where's Alessandro?" Where is he right now?" A beat. Something moved across the man's face. He lifted his radio, spoke into it in Italian, listened. His hand tightened on the radio. He spoke again, faster. He looked at her and the professional blankness that had been his face since she'd boarded cracked open. "Mr. DeLuca was separated from his detail on the interior stairwell," he said. "Deck 2. They're looking." She heard the words and felt what happened to her body when she heard them. A cold drop, somewhere central, the physical sensation of a floor disappearing. Separated. On the interior stairwell. Between the upper deck where she had been standing and the gangway where his team had been taking him. She turned and looked back at the ship. She looked at the door to the interior corridor. She thought about Lucien, positioned behind Alessandro's detail, moving with them through the interior, through the smoke and the alarm and the organized chaos where bodies lost each other in corridors. And a separation could look like exactly what it was, or it could look like exactly what someone needed it to look like. She thought, "I have no weapon, no authority, no proof, and no allies I can verify." She thought, "He is in there and I am the only person on this pier who knows with certainty what is happening." She turned to the security man. "Give me your radio." "Ms. Cross, give me your radio and tell me the layout of Deck 2. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the face of a woman who had finished being the version of herself that asked permission for things. He gave her the radio. And Evelyn Ashcroft Cross, who had signed papers that morning that confirmed she had nothing, who had been told by the man she'd married that she was worth less than the heir she displaced, turned back toward the burning ship and walked through the door because the only father she had ever had was somewhere in that smoke, and she was done letting other people decide what she was capable of. The smoke hit her on the first landing, not the clean gray of a contained fire. This was black, chemical, the kind that coats the inside of your throat and makes your eyes produce tears before your brain has processed the irritation. She pulled the collar of her coat up over her nose and kept moving down the stairwell, one hand on the metal rail. The rail warm in a way that rails weren't supposed to be warm. The radio in her other hand crackled, someone speaking Italian, fast, the words compressing together with urgency. She didn't have enough of the language to follow it, but she caught one word repeated twice, secondo piano, second floor, Deck 2. She was already on Deck 2. The corridor at the bottom of the stairwell was lit by emergency lighting, red strips along the floor, the overhead fluorescents killed by whatever the explosion had done to the power grid below. The red light turned everything the color of an old photograph and made distance judgment unreliable and made the smoke, drifting in slow horizontal layers at chest height, look almost solid. She moved left. The security man topside had told her the interior stairwell where Alessandro's detail had been was portside, midship. She was starboard. She needed to cross the width of the vessel on a deck that was filling with smoke from below. While somewhere in this red corridor, the man who had orchestrated the last 25 years of her life was making a move he had rehearsed long before anyone else knew the play had started. She moved fast, staying low where the smoke was thinner, past doors marked in Italian she couldn't read, past a fire suppression panel with 3 green lights and 1 red that was blinking with mechanical indifference to what was happening around it. She heard voices. Not the ship's alarm. Beneath it, actual voices. 2 men, one of them speaking with the clipped authority of someone giving instructions, one of them not speaking at all, and that second silence had a quality to it, a dense, pressurized quality that she recognized as the silence of someone being controlled rather than the silence of someone choosing not to speak. She stopped at the corner. She pressed her back against the wall and looked around the edge. 20 feet down the corridor, Alessandro on his knees, not fallen, placed. The posture of someone who had been put there deliberately, both hands visible at his sides, his white hair gray in the emergency lighting and a cut above his left eye, tracking blood down the side of his face in a thin, steady line. His coat was torn at the shoulder. Lucien stood behind him, one hand gripping Alessandro's collar with a casualness that was its own form of violence, the grip of a man who had done this before and had no need to perform the threat. In his other hand, something that caught the red light, a phone, not a weapon, and that detail rearranged the scene instantly because a weapon meant ending and a phone meant he needed something first. Two other men flanked the corridor, one at each end. Not Alessandro's security. Wrong posture, wrong positioning. These men faced outward, watching the approaches, which meant they had come aboard before the explosion and positioned themselves and waited. Catering staff. She thought of Alessandro's words in the meeting room. Someone I trusted completely. Trusted enough to be inside the vessel. Trusted enough to know the layout of Deck 2. She pulled back behind the corner. Her heart was doing something loud and structural in her chest, and she breathed through it, 4 counts in, because panic was a luxury she couldn't afford in the next 3 minutes, and she needed her brain running clean. She had a radio. She did not have a weapon. She did not have backup. She could confirm. The security personnel topside were responding to the explosion and looking for Alessandro, and might reach this corridor in the next 5 minutes or the next 20, and she had no way to know which. She had the layout of a ship she'd been on for less than 12 hours, and the knowledge that Lucien needed something from Alessandro before this ended, which meant Alessandro was still alive, which was the only structural advantage she currently possessed. She needed to know what he needed. She looked at the radio, pressed the transmit button once, a single click, no words, and hoped that whoever was monitoring the channel on the other end was paying close enough attention to register it as a signal rather than static. Then she moved. Not around the corner, back the way she'd come, to the fire suppression panel she'd passed 30 seconds ago. She opened it. 3 green lights, red blinking. She found the manual override for the corridor suppression system, a large red lever, clearly labeled with a pictogram that needed no translation, and she pulled it. The corridor filled with noise first, a pressurized mechanical shriek, 1 second of warning built into the system for exactly the reason she was about to experience. Then the suppression system discharged. Not water, the chemical suppressant, white and dense, filling the corridor in both directions from the ceiling-mounted nozzles with a violence that turned visibility to approximately 4 feet in under 3 seconds. She moved around the corner immediately, into the white, staying against the wall, counting steps. 2, 3, 4. She heard Lucien's voice, sharp now, the control in it stressed. Close the suppression. Close it. Bianchi. One of the flanking men moving, footsteps, away from her toward the suppression panel she'd just left. She kept counting. 12, 13. Her foot hit something. Alessandro's knee. She dropped to a crouch beside him, found his arm, gripped it. He turned toward her. Even in the white chemical cloud and the red light and the blood on his face, his eyes were clear. That surprised her, or didn't surprise her, because she was beginning to understand what kind of man he actually was. "Can you walk?" she said directly into his ear. "Yes." "Then walk." She had his arm. She pulled and he came up from his knees with the grunt of someone whose body was protesting but whose will had already overruled the protest, and they moved back along the wall, her counting the steps in reverse. 14, 13, 12. Lucien's voice again, somewhere behind them in the white. "She's in here. Find her." Footsteps. Multiple sets, no longer positioned at the corridor ends, converging. 11, 10, 9. Her back hit the corner. She turned them both around it and kept moving. Alessandro's arm across her shoulders now, his weight partial on her and heavier than she'd expected, and she felt the pull of it in her back and ignored the pull. The stairwell door was 15 feet ahead. She could see it. The white suppression cloud hadn't reached this far. The red emergency lighting was clear here, the door visible with its push bar, and the numbered plate, Ponte 2, Deck 2. She hit the door with her shoulder. They went through. The stairwell was cleaner. The smoke had migrated upward, the upper landing thick with it, but the landing they were on relatively breathable. She got Alessandro to the rail and stopped. He was breathing hard. The cut above his eye had slowed, but his face was pale in the way that meant pain rather than shock, the color of someone managing something rather than losing to it. "How bad?"
"Bad," she said. "Ribs," he said. 2, maybe 3. The fall on the stairs." He looked at her.
"Lucien hit me from behind. I didn't—" He stopped. His voice had done something she hadn't heard from him before, a fracture in the controlled surface. 20 years. I know. I gave him everything. I know. We can't do this right now. She had the radio up. I'm pressing transmit. Talk. Tell your people where we are. He took the radio. Spoke in Italian, controlled despite the fractured ribs, the language organizing itself in his mouth with the efficiency of a man who had been giving orders his whole life, and whose body still knew how even when the rest of him was in the process of being destroyed. He listened to the response. Spoke again. Listened. He looked at her. Marco is on the main deck. 40 seconds. Tell him starboard stairwell, deck 2 landing. He told him. They had 30 seconds of silence in which the only sounds were the ship's alarm and the distant crash of the suppression system and Alessandro's breathing, which was doing the measured, deliberate work of someone counting each inhale against the pain of compromised ribs. Then the door above them opened and Marco came down the stairs with 2 other men at his back. And his face when he saw Alessandro did something complicated that it immediately disciplined back into function. Sir, I'm standing, Alessandro said. Lucien, deck 2, midship port. 2 men with him, possibly more. Marco spoke into his own radio. Rapid, precise. He looked at Evelyn over Alessandro's head, and what passed between them in that look was not warm and not unfriendly. It was the recognition of 2 people who have been on the same side for less than an hour, but who have established, under pressure, that they can trust each other's actions. Get him out, she said. Off the ship, now. The pier, then away from the pier. If Lucien has people topside, we have the perimeter, Marco said. Our people. Are you certain? He had men aboard who weren't yours. A pause. Marco keyed his radio, asked something, received an answer. The 2 on deck 2 came aboard as contracted maintenance staff. Checked in at 0400. His jaw was tight. The manifest was approved by Lucien's office. Alessandro made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The sound a person makes when they understand fully and finally the scale of what has been done to them. Go, Evelyn said to Marco. Get him to the pier. I'll follow. Ms. Cross, I'll follow. Marco looked at Alessandro. Alessandro looked at Evelyn and said nothing, which was its own form of assent, the acknowledgement of a man who understood, watching his daughter make a choice he recognized because he had made it himself a long time ago. They went up. She went down. She didn't have a plan. What she had was the knowledge that Lucien would not stay on deck 2 now, that the suppression system had discharged and his target had disappeared. He would move. And a man who was moving through a compromised ship with a timeline that had just accelerated beyond his control would move toward his exit, and his exit was the same as everyone else's exit, the gangway, starboard side, forward. She came out of the stairwell on deck 1, forward section, and she was right. Lucien was 30 feet ahead of her. He was moving fast without appearing to run. The controlled pace walk of a man who knew that running signaled panic, and panic invited interception. One of the 2 flanking men was with him. The other had presumably not made it out of the suppression cloud quickly enough. He hadn't seen her. His eyes were forward, on the gangway door, on the rectangle of gray dawn light visible through the porthole in the door. She looked at her hands. No weapon. No radio. She'd given it to Alessandro. No backup she could confirm was hers rather than Lucien's. She looked at the corridor. There was a fire extinguisher in a red bracket on the wall at her left. Standard dry chemical, approximately 5 kilograms. She lifted it out of the bracket, and it was heavier than expected, and she adjusted her grip and breathed. Then she said, in a voice calibrated to carry down the corridor without echoing, Lucien. He stopped. He turned slowly. The man beside him turned faster, saw her, moved his hand, and stopped moving when Lucien held up one finger without looking at him, a gesture of absolute control. Not yet. He looked at her across 30 feet of corridor and the smile arrived. Not the warm, calibrated one she'd seen in the meeting room. Something different. Something that had stopped needing to perform warmth because the room it was performing for no longer existed. You're remarkable, he said. Not a compliment, an assessment. I've watched the file on you for 8 months and I still didn't... You watched a file, she said. You didn't watch me. Fair distinction. He tilted his head. Where's Alessandro? Off the ship. Something moved through his expression. Not panic. Recalculation. Then there's nothing keeping you here, he said. Walk off this ship, Ms. Cross. Get in a car. Take Alessandro and go wherever people like you go when they decide not to be what they're supposed to be. Leave the organization to people who know how to run it." He took 2 steps toward her, easy steps, the steps of a man who had assessed his situation and identified an outcome he preferred. "You've been in Ashcroft for 25 years. You don't know the first thing about what the DeLuca name actually requires." "I know you killed for it," she said. "I built it." For the first time, the controlled surface cracked, not with emotion but with something more dangerous, conviction. "Alessandro was losing ground for years before I took over operational control. Every expansion in the last decade, every secured contract, every network we maintained while our competitors collapsed, that was me. Not him. Not some daughter he couldn't find. Me." His voice had stayed even throughout this, but there was something underneath the evenness now, a pressure that had been building for 20 years and had found, in this red-lit corridor on a damaged ship at dawn, a moment to push against its container. He was going to hand it to you, someone who didn't know the names of half the operations, someone who walked in from a divorce hearing with $8,000 and a gray dress. The contempt was precise and cold, and she recognized it because she had heard its exact structure before in a different voice in a different room, and she had spent the last 24 hours deciding what it meant that people who needed to diminish her had to work so hard to do it. "He was going to hand it to me," she said, "because it was mine." She discharged the fire extinguisher. Full straight discharge at 30 feet. Not accurate, but not meant to be accurate. Meant to do what chemical discharge does in an enclosed space, which is eliminate visibility instantly and completely and force a person who has been operating on the advantage of being able to see into a situation where they cannot. Lucien threw his arm up across his face. The man beside him stepped back, instinctive, the backward step of a person whose threat assessment hasn't yet caught up with their body. She was already moving, not toward Lucien. That was the wrong move with a man who had a weapon and a trained associate and 20 years of operational experience. She moved right, through the door she'd passed 30 seconds ago. A storage room, shelving, equipment she didn't stop to identify. Through the room to the far door, which put her in a parallel corridor, which put her 6 feet from the gangway door that Lucien had been walking toward. She hit it, and she was outside, and the dawn air hit her face like the cold water she desperately needed. And she was on the gangway moving down, and her legs were not steady, but they were moving. She reached the pier. Marco was there. Alessandro was there. On his feet, his hand on Marco's arm. Emergency vehicles were on the pier now, blue lights on the water, a fire crew moving up the gangway she had just come down. The security perimeter had closed. She could see Marco's people at intervals, and she could see 3 people in the custody of 2 of those people who were not Marco's people and who were not going anywhere. Then she heard from the gangway above a shot, single, distinct, the specific acoustic signature of a firearm in an enclosed metal space, flat and hard and final sounding in a way that movie gunshots never quite captured. Then nothing. Marco moved. Alessandro moved. She moved with them, back toward the gangway, and the fire crew coming down it had stopped at the bottom and was looking back up with the particular frozen posture of people who have encountered something outside their protocol. 20 seconds. 30. Damien Cross came down the gangway. She stared at him. Of every variable her brain had been tracking since 3 in the morning, Damien had not been among the active ones. He was in yesterday's court clothes, his jacket gone, his shirt dark at the shoulder. Not blood, she assessed in under a second, sweat and suppressant residue. And he had a phone in one hand and in the other he had Lucien's arm, specifically Lucien's wrist, bent at an angle that communicated control without requiring further clarification. Lucien was walking. His face was... She searched for the word and found it. Finished. Not the finished of defeat, but the finished of a particular kind of mask, the expression of a man who has held a performance together for 20 years and has just felt it come apart in his hands and cannot yet locate the face that exists underneath it. He was making a call, Damien said, when he reached the bottom. He wasn't talking to her specifically. He was talking to anyone who was in a position to receive information and act on it. I got to the ship 20 minutes ago. I followed him through deck 2 when he lost you in the suppression cloud. He was trying to reach whoever is on the other end of the Malta account. I have the number. I have the call log on this phone. He held it up. I have 11 months of transactions I pulled from my father's archived files last night. Paper copies. They're in my car. He looked at Evelyn. His expression was complicated in the way of something that was carrying too much to be reduced to a single legible thing. I found the files last night after the harbor. My father kept physical copies of everything. I don't know if he was paranoid or meticulous or both. A pause. I think he knew eventually that what he'd done was wrong. I think he kept the records because he couldn't bring himself to destroy the evidence of it. I don't know. I don't know what he was. Marco already had Lucien. Two of his people took Lucien's other arm, and the transfer happened with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what to do with someone they'd just received. Lucien didn't resist. He looked at Alessandro. Alessandro looked back. The thing that passed between them in that look was not something Evelyn tried to name. It was 20 years of a relationship that had been real on one side and constructed on the other, and it was the specific devastation of a man who had spent decades giving everything he had to a person who had been arranging, the entire time, for everything to eventually be taken. The look lasted 4 seconds. Then Alessandro looked away, and the way he turned his head, deliberately, with finality, the way you turn away from something you are choosing to leave behind, was more devastating than anything she had seen in the last 24 hours. Lucien said, "You built nothing without me." Alessandro didn't turn back. "Everything you think survives you," Lucien said, louder now. The control finally fracturing the way controlled things fracture. All at once, the pressure that had been contained for 20 years finding the crack and moving through it. It exists because I made it exist. You were the name. I was everything underneath the name. Marco's people moved him away down the pier. His voice carried back for a few seconds. Then the distance swallowed it. The harbor was pale gold now, the sun having committed to the day somewhere in the last 30 minutes. The water reflecting it in the flat, indifferent way water reflects everything. The ship behind them was still alarming, the fire crew working, the blue lights of the emergency vehicles painting everything in intervals. Alessandro stood on the pier and breathed. She stood beside him and breathed. Damien stood 6 feet away and held his father's evidence against his chest with both arms, like something he couldn't decide whether to carry or set down. "Why?" she said, to Damien. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question, the specific inquiry of someone who needs information in order to understand the shape of the last 7 years correctly. He looked at her. "Because I spent last night reading what my father did, and I'm not him." He said it without drama, without the rhetorical architecture he usually applied to things. Just the sentence, bare, set down in front of her. "I'm not him, and I can't undo it, but I can stop." He stopped. "I can stop being the thing that was built on top of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the courtroom. Nothing of measurable value. She thought about 7 years. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of a man who had reduced her to a line item and find, inside herself, something that was not forgiveness. She was nowhere near forgiveness, but was at least the recognition that people were capable of being different things than the worst they'd done. She was the living evidence of that. "Give the files to Marco," she said. "He'll know what to do with them." She turned to Alessandro. He was still looking at the water, at the gold light on it, at the city beyond the harbor that was waking up into a morning that had no idea what had just been resolved on one of its piers while most of its residents were still asleep. "I need medical attention," he said. "My ribs." The way he said it, flat, practical, was the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of humor, the humorous thing delivered as pure information. "I know," she said, "and then we have a great deal to discuss." "I know that too." He looked at her. The morning light was not kind to his face. It showed every year, every decision, every 15 years of searching and not finding. But there was something in his eyes that she had no vocabulary for yet, because the vocabulary you need to describe the expression of a person looking at something they had decided to stop hoping for and found anyway, didn't exist in any language she'd been taught. She didn't look away. She had spent 34 years becoming the woman who signed papers and said nothing and contributed nothing of measurable value, and she had spent the last 18 hours becoming someone else entirely, and she was not finished becoming that person, not even close. But she was standing on solid ground on a pier at sunrise, with a father she had not known she had, and evidence that the man who had stolen her identity from her was in custody, and the particular dead weight of invisibility had left her body sometime between the stairwell and the corridor. And she could not locate the exact moment it had gone, but she could feel its absence, the way you feel the absence of something that has been pressing on you so long you'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. Marco appeared at her shoulder. "Ms. Cross, there's one more thing." She turned. He was holding a phone. On the screen, a text message, received 4 minutes ago on Lucian's confiscated device, from a number logged simply as V. The message read, "It's done. She's not coming back out. Tell me where to meet you." Evelyn read it twice. She looked at Marco. "Vanessa." "She was on the pier," Marco said. "She arrived 40 minutes ago. We have her." Evelyn exhaled, slow, measured, the breath of someone whose system is beginning to understand that the immediate emergency has passed, even while the larger one continues. She looked at the ship, at the fire crew on the gangway, at the blue lights and the gold water, and the city that was about to wake up to the largest story it had run in years. She looked at Damien, who was standing with the files against his chest, and the expression of a man waiting to find out what happens next. She looked at Alessandro, who was waiting with his fractured ribs and his fractured 20 years and whatever came after both. She thought, "I walked into a courthouse yesterday morning as no one." She thought, "I am not no one." She thought, "Now we find out what comes next." They took Alessandro to a private medical facility 20 minutes from the harbor. Not a hospital, a clinic, the kind that existed in every major city if you knew the right people, staffed by physicians who understood discretion as a professional requirement rather than a courtesy. Marco made the arrangements by phone during the drive, and by the time the car pulled into the underground entrance, there were 2 doctors waiting at the door with the unhurried readiness of people who had been briefed and had prepared accordingly. Evelyn rode with Alessandro in the back seat and said very little, and Alessandro said very little, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through something together and had not yet located the language for it, and had jointly decided, without discussion, that the absence of language was acceptable for now. He gripped her hand once, briefly, when the car went over a rough section of road and the movement jarred his ribs. She didn't comment on it. He didn't release her hand immediately. She didn't move it. At the clinic, they took him into an examination room, and she sat in a chair in the corridor outside and felt, for the first time since she had stood on the courtroom floor and heard that horn, the specific weight of the last 36 hours settle onto her all at once. It was not dramatic. It was more like the way a building sounds when a structural load is finally distributed correctly. A settling, a series of small adjustments, the sensation of something finding its proper configuration. She was still in the gray dress. She thought about that for a moment and then stopped thinking about it because it wasn't the most important thing, and her brain was trying to use it as a distraction from the more important things, which was a habit she recognized in herself and did not currently have the patience for. Marco appeared and handed her a coffee in a paper cup. She took it. "Vanessa Hale," she said. He sat down in the chair beside her. He was built for standing, the kind of man who used chairs reluctantly, and the chair made him look slightly incongruous, which humanized him in a way she found useful. "In our custody, along with 2 of Lucien's operational people we picked up on the pier perimeter. The 3rd man, the one from the Deck 2 corridor, we have him as well. He came off the ship with the fire crew." A pause. "Voluntarily. I think the suppression discharge convinced him that being cooperative was in his long-term interest." "What about Lucien's external network? If he's been running parallel operations for years..." "We've had a financial forensics team on standby for 11 months, Marco said. Alessandro suspected, not Lucien specifically, but suspected something internal. We were building the case quietly. What Damien Cross brought this morning gave us the connection points we needed to move on 4 separate accounts simultaneously." He looked at his coffee as though assessing it. "It's already in motion. By this evening, the network will be significantly less functional than it was at sunrise." She absorbed that. "Damien? He's at a police liaison's office, voluntarily. He brought a lawyer." Marco paused again. "His own lawyer, not his firm." She understood the distinction. "He's exposing his father's firm. The records he has implicate 6 attorneys in the original conspiracy. 2 of them are still practicing." Marco looked at her. "One of them reviewed your divorce settlement yesterday morning." She let that sit for a moment. The particular architecture of it. The way the corruption had threaded itself through the ordinary infrastructure of her ordinary life. The attorney who'd reviewed her papers having been connected, however distantly and historically, to the documents that had erased her identity in the first place. The world was not as large as it appeared to be. The people who did harm to other people existed in networks, and the networks were smaller and more persistent than anyone who hadn't been inside one tended to imagine. "Is he going to be all right?" she said. Damien. Marco considered this with the care of a man who took the precision of language seriously. He's going to face consequences. The question is whether they're the kind he chose or the kind that happened to him. Right now he's choosing them, which is better. She nodded. The doctor came out 40 minutes later and told her Alessandro had 2 fractured ribs, a mild concussion from the fall on the stairwell, and the cut above his eye had required 4 stitches. He was resting. He'd been asking for her. She went in. The room was small and clean and smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled clinic air, and Alessandro was lying in the bed with the posture of a man who found horizontal positions professionally insulting but had accepted the current necessity. The stitches above his eye were neat. His color was better. An IV ran to his left arm with the quiet industry of something doing its job without requiring acknowledgement. She sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her for a moment. "You went back into the ship," he said. "Yes. After I told Marco to get you out." "You told Marco to get you out," she said. "The instruction regarding me was implicit." Something moved in his expression that might, on a less controlled face, have been the beginning of a smile. "You split that distinction quite carefully." "I've had practice." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Lucien is in custody. Marco's people have the network. Vanessa Hale is in custody. Damien is at a police liaison's office with his father's records." She paused. "I think that covers the immediate situation." "The immediate situation," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Catherine. She called me at 3 in the morning. She told me about the Maltese account and warned me to come to you before Lucien could frame the morning. She left the ship at 4:47 because she knew what was about to happen, and she knew she couldn't stop it from the inside." Evelyn looked at him. "She has been trying to protect you from Lucien for years. She couldn't prove it, and she knew that going to you directly would give him the opportunity to discredit her, so she found another way." She paused. "She found me." Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man processing something that was too large to process with his eyes open. "Where is she now?" "I don't know, but I think she'll come back when she knows it's safe." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "She's been with you for 32 years. She's not running from you. She was running from him. I was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that she thought he might have drifted towards sleep. The combination of pain medication and the accumulated exhaustion of the last 18 hours finally reaching critical mass." Then he said without opening his eyes, "I owe her an apology." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You do." He opened his eyes at that, the directness of it, the absence of softening. He looked at her. "You're going to be very difficult," he said. "Probably," she agreed. This time, the thing in his expression was unmistakably a smile, small and tired and real. The smile of a person who has been offered something they had stopped expecting and are still in the process of believing it exists. She stayed until he slept. Then she went back to the corridor. The interrogation of Vanessa Hale happened that afternoon in a room that Marco's organization maintained for exactly this kind of conversation. Not a police facility, a private room, the kind of arrangement that existed in the gray space between official process and organizational necessity. Evelyn insisted on being present. Marco argued briefly. She looked at him with the expression she was developing, the one that communicated that the argument was already finished, and he stopped arguing. Vanessa looked different without the context of the courtroom gallery. Smaller, somehow, or not smaller, but less assembled. Her hair not quite right, a chip in the nail polish on her left hand, the ivory dress replaced by whatever Marco's people had provided, which was a plain dark jacket and an expression that was working very hard to maintain composure and was mostly succeeding. She looked at Evelyn when Evelyn came in, and something moved across her face that Evelyn had not expected. Not defiance, not fear, not the performative contrition of someone calculating their next move. Something closer to relief. The expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy and is very tired and has decided, perhaps only in this moment, that they are done carrying it. "How much did he pay you?" Evelyn said. She sat across the table. No preamble, because preamble gave people time to reconstruct their defenses. Vanessa looked at her hands. 2.4 million, she said, over 14 months. And what was the arrangement? Get close to Damien, stay close. Make sure the marriage ended and ended badly. Make sure you walked out with nothing and had no resources and no stability and no platform to find out what you were. She paused. He told me you were the daughter of a criminal, that you were going to claim an inheritance that would be used to fund. She stopped, looked up. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you needed $2.4 million badly enough to accept a story that you should have questioned more carefully, Evelyn said. Did you? A long pause. My mother's medical debt, Vanessa said, and I needed. She stopped again. The assembled version of herself, the one who performed confidence for 3 million people and had learned to present the surface rather than the interior, was visibly failing her in this room. I needed to believe I was doing something that justified. She shook her head. No, that's not honest. I did it because the money was real and the justification was convenient, and I'm good at not looking too closely at things that pay well. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. She thought about all the ways she could respond to this. She had spent enough time in Vanessa's proximity to have accumulated a specific personal quality of anger that had nowhere to go. Not the sharp anger of betrayal, more the dull, exhausted anger of a woman who had been used as a prop in other people's arrangements for so long that the list of those people was now long enough to require documentation. The text you sent this morning, Evelyn said. It's done. She's not coming back out. Vanessa's face went through something complicated and difficult and landed on the expression of someone who has heard the worst version of themselves read back to them in their own words. I didn't know. You didn't know there were explosives on that ship, Evelyn said. Or you didn't know I was actually inside when you sent it. Silence. Which one? Evelyn said. I didn't know about the explosives, Vanessa said. Quietly. Precisely. The statement of someone who has decided that whatever happens next, they're going to be accurate about what they knew and when. He told me you'd left the ship and he wanted to know where to meet. I thought. She looked at her chipped nail. I thought you'd gone. I thought he was cleaning up the arrangement. I sent the message because I was finishing my part of it. She looked up. I didn't know anyone was trying to kill you. But you knew someone was trying to make sure I had nothing. Yes. And you were part of that. Yes. Evelyn held her gaze. Okay, she said. I need you to write down everything, every contact, every payment, every instruction, everything Lucian told you about what he was doing and why, every person he mentioned. She slid a legal pad across the table. All of it, tonight. Vanessa looked at the pad. And then what? And then you cooperate fully with whatever process follows, Evelyn said. And then you get a lawyer and you figure out what comes next. I'm not your enemy, Vanessa. I'm also not your advocate. But I need what you know, and you need to give it to someone who isn't Lucian, so here we are. She stood and left the room. In the corridor, Marco was waiting. He had the expression of a man who had watched something through the one-way glass and was recalibrating. She'll cooperate, Evelyn said. I heard. The DNA confirmation, she said. Dominic mentioned 48 hours. The lab is already running it, Marco said. Alessandro authorized it this morning before the ship. He paused. We don't need it. The photograph, the financial trail, the records Damien brought. The evidentiary picture is complete, but Alessandro wanted it done properly. I know, she said. So did I. The results came back 31 hours later. She was in the clinic when they arrived. Alessandro was sitting up by then, eating something he found insulting and complaining about it in Italian, and then translating the complaints into English for her benefit, which she recognized as his way of including her in the ordinary texture of a morning. She recognized it because it was what people did when they were trying to build something small and daily and durable in the space where something larger and more complicated was still settling. Dominic brought the document in and set it on the table between them and stepped back. She looked at it. The percentage at the top of the page, the probability of the biological relationship, was so close to absolute that the decimal points were a formality. Alessandro looked at it. He didn't say anything. He picked up his fork and put it down and looked out the window at the building across the street, which was an ordinary building with ordinary windows and ordinary people moving behind them, none of whom had any idea what was being established in this small clinic room at this specific moment. Elena, he said. She had told him, on the ship, not to call her that yet. Not yet. She had meant it. She heard the name now and waited for the resistance that had been there before, the refusal of something that had been taken from her and that she wasn't ready to take back, and she found that the resistance was smaller than it had been. Not gone, but smaller. The size of something that could be held rather than something that held you. I'm still Evelyn, she said. Yes. But I can be both. He looked at her. The morning light through the window was ordinary and sufficient and showed his face exactly as it was, age and damage, and the particular quality of a person who has survived things by refusing to stop. Yes, he said again, you can be both. She nodded. She looked at the document. She put it in the folder that she was developing, the one that was becoming the archive of the last 72 hours and everything they had produced. I want to know everything about the organization, she said. Not the cleaned-up version Dominic would put in a briefing. The actual version. Every operation, every relationship, every decision you made, and what it cost. I want to know what it is before I decide what to do with it. Alessandro looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to be able to read. This one meant he was recalibrating, adjusting his expectation of what she was going to say against what she had actually said, which was apparently not what he'd expected. I was going to offer to step back, he said carefully. To give you time to… I don't need you to step back, she said. I need you to teach me. There's a difference. She met his eyes. I'm 34 years old. I have a folder with $8,000 in it and a DNA result and 72 hours of experience navigating something I didn't know existed 3 days ago. I need time, and I need information, and I need someone who knows the terrain. That's what I need from you. A pause. Everything else we figure out as we go. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's very sensible. I know. Your mother was sensible, he said. In exactly this way. She would analyze a situation completely and then state the logical course of action as though it were obvious to anyone, which made the people around her feel simultaneously stupid and reassured. He looked at the window. I spent 25 years trying to remember her voice accurately. I've been worried I was getting it wrong. He looked back at Evelyn. I don't think I was. She didn't know what to do with that, so she let it be. The way you let things be when they're too large to respond to adequately, and any response would diminish them. 3 weeks later, Lucien Moretti was formally charged across 4 jurisdictions. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, orchestrating the original kidnapping through a chain of evidence that Damien's records and Vanessa's cooperation and 11 months of Alessandro's quiet audit had made irrefutable. His attorneys were competent and expensive and found, over the following weeks, that competent and expensive had limits when the evidentiary foundation was as complete as this one was. He said, at his first formal hearing, that he had built everything and been given nothing, and that history would eventually clarify who had actually sustained the DeLuca organization through 20 years of a changing world. He said it with the composed conviction of a man who had been preparing this statement for years against the possibility that he might one day need it. The judge listened and then moved the proceeding forward, because courts had their own relationship with prepared statements, and it was a professional one rather than an emotional one. Evelyn was not in the courtroom for that hearing. She was in a conference room in a building 4 blocks from the harbor, sitting across a table from Dominic and 2 financial investigators and a woman named Reyes, who ran the maritime operations and who had spent the first 20 minutes of their first meeting clearly assessing whether Evelyn was a liability or an asset, and had spent the subsequent 3 weeks apparently concluding the latter. Vanessa Hale pled guilty to conspiracy and 2 counts of fraud. The attempted murder charge was reduced in exchange for her cooperation, which had been thorough enough to be genuinely useful rather than strategically curated. She received a sentence that her lawyer described as lenient, and that Evelyn, reading about it in a brief that Marco prepared, thought was probably accurate. She didn't attend that proceeding either. She sent a formal statement through Dominic's office that said what it needed to say and nothing more. Damian Cross walked into a police station on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the harbor with his new attorney and a complete set of his father's physical records and his own financial disclosure covering his entire career and the names of every official he had professional relationships with who appeared in those records. It took most of the day. He came out in the late afternoon into a world in which his career as an attorney was over, and several people he had known professionally were facing their own proceedings, and his father's legacy was a document trail rather than a reputation. He texted her once, not to explain or apologize. She thought he understood by then that both were insufficient to the scale of what had happened between them and that she was not the right recipient for either. He texted her to tell her that he hoped she was all right. That was all. She read it. She put her phone in her pocket. She thought about it on and off for a day, and then she wrote back 3 words. I'm becoming someone. She sent it. She didn't wait for a response. She put her phone away and went back to what she'd been doing, which was reading a shipping contract that Reyes needed reviewed before the end of the week. Catherine came back on a Thursday, 8 weeks after the harbor. She appeared at the clinic where Alessandro was doing his final follow-up appointment. He had been discharged 3 weeks prior, but the physician wanted one more set of imaging on the ribs. And she was sitting in the corridor when Evelyn came out to wait. Plain clothes, no luggage that was visible. The upright posture of a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it with the full weight of her spine. She looked at Evelyn. He's going to want to see you, Evelyn said. He's known for 6 weeks that you were protecting him, and he has been building up a conversation in his head that he wants to have with you. I'd prepare for it to be longer than seems necessary. Catherine's face did something complicated that eventually resolved into something that might have been relief and might have been grief, and was probably both, since the two things had been occupying the same space inside her for a very long time. He's angry? She said. No, Evelyn said. He's sorry. She paused. Which will probably be harder. Catherine sat down in the corridor chair and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and got herself together with the efficiency of a woman who had been getting herself together for 60 years and had considerable practice. Then she looked at Evelyn with an expression of direct, frank assessment. You turned out well, she said. I'm working on it, Evelyn said. The doctor came out and Evelyn went in and told Alessandro that Catherine was in the corridor and watched his face do the thing it did. The controlled surface and whatever moved beneath it, slower and larger and more complicated than anything the surface showed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he straightened against the examination table and said, Send her in, please. With the dignity of a man who has spent a lifetime building the capacity to meet difficult things without requiring them to be easier than they are. Evelyn sent her in. She went back to the corridor and sat in the chair Catherine had vacated and listened to nothing, because the room was properly soundproofed, and she let the quiet of the corridor be what it was for a few minutes, the quiet of something that had found its resting place. 4 months after the harbor, the DeLuca organization filed its formal restructuring documents under Evelyn's signature. Not a dissolution, a transformation. The maritime operations, the security consulting arm, the international logistics network, all of it redirected. Some of it wound down in the areas where it couldn't be made legitimate, and the winding down was handled by Dominic and Reyes with the thoroughness of people who understood that how you ended something was as important as how you built it. What remained was substantial and complex and entirely defensible in daylight, and it operated under a board structure that Alessandro had designed and Evelyn had revised and Catherine had reviewed with the precision of 32 years of institutional knowledge. Alessandro retained an advisory role. He had argued, briefly, for something more operational, and Evelyn had listened to the argument and acknowledged its merits and said no. And after a pause, he had nodded with the expression of a man accepting a correction that he needed and perhaps had been waiting for. On the morning the restructuring documents were filed, they were on the ship. Not the same ship. The original vessel was still in dry dock, its lower decks rebuilt after the explosion, the work supervised by a crew that Marco had vetted personally. This was a smaller vessel, Alessandro's secondary boat, the one he'd used for transit rather than ceremony, and it sat in the harbor in the early morning with the quiet purpose of a thing that existed to move rather than to impress. They were on the stern deck, the same configuration as the morning of the explosion, 6 weeks prior, except that the sky was different, clear and cold, the kind of blue that only existed in autumn at that latitude. and the harbor was still with the particular stillness of early hours before commercial traffic began. Alessandro had a cup of coffee. She had one too. They stood at the rail and looked at the city. "The attorney in Naples wants a response this week," she said. "The maritime licensing." "Tell him Tuesday." "I told him Monday." A pause. "Then tell him Monday," he said. She looked at the city. At the courthouse, visible in the middle distance, its scaffolding finally gone. The East Wing renovation completed sometime in the last month, the building looking cleaner and more resolved than it had on the morning she'd signed her name to a document that said she was worth nothing. "I've been thinking about the name," she said. Alessandro waited. "I was Evelyn Ashcroft Cross for 7 years, and Evelyn Ashcroft for 9 years before that, and Elena DeLuca for 9 years before that," she said. "I've had 3 names, and I've only known what 2 of them meant. What do you want to do?" She thought about it. She had been thinking about it for weeks, in the background, the way you think about things that don't have obvious answers. Not as a problem to solve, but as a question to live with, until the living with it produces something usable. "I think I want to keep both," she said. "Evelyn, because it's mine. Because I built a life in it, even if the life was built on a floor that someone else had rotted. And DeLuca, because—" She paused. Not because she didn't know the reason, but because she wanted to say it accurately. "Because it's also mine. Because the things that were taken from me don't stop being mine just because they were taken." Alessandro looked at the water. She watched his profile. The white hair, the straight nose, the jaw that held its line even when the rest of his face was doing something. "Evelyn DeLuca," he said. "Yes." He nodded. Not with ceremony, not with the weight of a formal pronouncement, just the small, conclusive nod of a person accepting something that is correct and needs no further elaboration. The city was waking up below them. She could see lights coming on in buildings, traffic beginning on the waterfront road, a delivery truck pulling up to a restaurant that wouldn't open for 3 more hours. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning in a city that had, 4 months ago, watched a woman walk out of a courthouse with nothing and found out, by that evening, that nothing was not the same as no one. She had not watched the news coverage. She had read the documents and reviewed the legal filings and attended the meetings she needed to attend, but the narrative that other people were constructing about her, she had mostly left to be constructed without her participation, because she had found that she was not particularly interested in the version of herself that required an audience. She thought about the woman who had sat in that courtroom in a gray dress with folded hands and said nothing and signed her name and walked toward the door. She could still locate that woman inside herself, not as a past self she was ashamed of or had transcended, but as something more like a foundation. The patience that woman had cultivated, the capacity for stillness, the ability to be in a room and understand it without being understood in return. Those things had not been limitations. They had been an education she hadn't known she was receiving in a subject she hadn't known she would need. You didn't waste what had been spent on you, even when it had been spent badly. Alessandro finished his coffee. He set the cup on the rail and turned slightly and looked at her with the morning light on his face and the expression she had learned by now to read as the one he reserved for things he wanted to say and was determining whether to say. "Say it," she said. He looked out at the water. "I was going to say that I spent 15 years being afraid I would find you and you would be diminished. That what they did to you would have made you into someone smaller." He paused. "I was wrong to be afraid of that." She looked at the harbor, at the flat blue water, and the city, and the courthouse, and the world that had, 4 months ago, required her to be invisible, and had since had occasion to reconsider that requirement. "You weren't entirely wrong," she said. "I was smaller, for a long time." She turned to look at him, because the thing she was about to say deserved to be said to his face. But small things that survive long enough sometimes find out what they're actually made of. It just takes the right pressure. He held her gaze. His eyes were the color of deep water in the morning light, and they were tired, and they were something else. The specific quality of a person looking at something they have chosen to stop being afraid of losing. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. The ship sat steady in the harbor. The city moved into its morning around them. The water held the light, and the light held the sky. And somewhere in the building documents and the closed cases and the names that had been assigned to what had happened, a story was finishing itself in the way that stories actually finished. Not with resolution, which was clean, but with continuation, which was the only honest ending for people who were still alive and still choosing. Evelyn DeLuca stood at the rail and breathed the cold harbor air and looked at the horizon where the water met the sky in a line so clean it looked like someone had drawn it deliberately, and she felt the particular steadiness of a person who has stopped waiting to find out who they are. She already knew. The ship's engine turned over once, low and ready, and the water beneath the hull shifted with the slow purpose of something that had decided where it was going, and the morning held them both, the old man with his coffee cup and his 30 years of searching and his fractured ribs healing clean, and the woman in her coat with her folder and her 3 names and the horizon she was looking at with the calm, forward attention of someone who had stopped looking back. The city fell behind them. The water opened ahead.